So, Chapter 8. Clovis had come up the river in an old tramp steamer which carried anything from cattle to timber. He had paid the last of his money to the captain, who had allowed him to crouch on deck between a grate of bleating nanny goats and a leaking sack of maize, but he wouldn't put Clovis off at the Carter's landing stage. Bad place, he said. And he made Clovis get out onto an old jetty higher up and walk back along the bank, so that by the time he reached the bungalow he was scratched and tired and very hot. But now, as he made his way up the gravel path to the house, his spirits rose. It was so neat and tidy and quiet. No chickens to give you fleas, no barking dogs running the length of their chains. Dusk had fallen and 2 of the windows were lit up. Clovis walked quietly towards them and looked in. He saw a most comforting sight. The Carters were having supper, sitting round a large table spread with a clean white cloth. He could see Mrs. Carter, a kind, plump woman in a blue dress with frilly sleeves, serving something onto pudding plates. A pink blancmange. Clovis could see it shaking a little on the dish and his mouth watered. Shape, his foster mother had called it. She made it with strawberries and cornflour and milk fresh from the cow. Opposite Mrs. Carter was her husband, a thin man in gold-rimmed spectacles, and facing him the twins. They looked just the way Maya had described them on the boat, pretty and dressed in white, with ribbons in their hair. And beside them, Maya. The twins were pretty, but Maya was special with her serious face and kind eyes. He could see her pigtail looped over her shoulder. Just looking at it made him feel safe, as if he could hold on to it and be all right. Miss Minton didn't seem to be there. Perhaps it was her day off, and she'd gone to visit friends. He stood and looked a little longer, unseen by the people in the room. It was a good name for this house, Tefurny, a place of rest. Then he went round to the side of the house and knocked on the door. It only took a few moments to shatter Clovis's dream. First there came the violent shrilling of an alarm bell. Then a maid with a sullen face led him to the dining room and opened the door. And the twins looked up, stared at him, and exploded. It wasn't laughter that came from them, not really. It was that awful giggling, that high-pitched, merciless titter that had spread across the footlights in the theatre and set all the other children off. Clovis recognised it at once. So it was the twins' laughter which had hounded him. "Oh," gasped Beatrice, "it's little Lord Fauntleroy." And then both girls said, "Will I have to stop being your little boy?" in a deep and growly voice, and repeated it, their voices getting lower and lower. And in between, they choked and spluttered and patted each other on the back and started taunting him again. Clovis stood perfectly still by the door. He looked at Maya to see if she too was going to join in, but she looked horrified, and now she jumped up and down and came to stand beside him. "Don't," she said passionately to the twins. "Please don't. Can't you see?" Mrs. Carter now took charge. "All right, girls," she said to her daughter, "that will do." And to Maya, "Sit down, please. We have not finished our meal." But it took some time for the twins to quieten down. They still growled and gulped, and then Beatrice said, "Look at Maya protecting her boyfriend." "Enough," said Mr. Carter, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. It was the first word he had spoken at the table, and it was to be the last, but the twins now managed to control themselves. "Now," said Mr. Carter, staring at Clovis, "might I ask what brings you here?" Clovis looked at the soft, rounded face. Close to it did not look so kind and motherly as it had done through the window. He felt that under that puffy cheeks one would find stone. "I wondered if I could stay with you for a few days. We had to leave the hotel, all of us, and I thought..." His words died away. Maya now turned to Mrs. Carter and stretched out her hands to her as if she was begging for her life. "Oh, please, please, Mrs. Carter, couldn't he stay? He'd have my room, and I would go to sleep with Miss Minton. I'm sure Mr. Murray will help him to..." "Stay?" Mrs. Carter interrupted in a horrified voice. "Stay with us," said Beatrice. "We don't have actors to stay, do we, Gwendolen?" Both twins shook their heads slowly, left to right and right to left. They reminded Maya of the women knitting by the guillotine during the French Revolution, while heads rolled into baskets. "Heaven knows what he might have picked up at the Paradiso," said Mrs. Carter. And to Clovis, "What are those bites on your legs, fleas or bedbugs?" Clovis flushed. There were bedbugs at the Paradiso. He minded it just as much as Mrs. Carter, but it was true that he no longer looked like a boy wonder on the stage. It had been impossible to get hot water at the hotel, his long hair was unwashed, his clothes were too small for him, and stained. "We can't just turn him out," said Maya desperately. "I hope you don't think we can take in every vermin stray that comes to the door. The boy must go back. Beatrice, go and fetch Miss Minton," said Miss Carter. "I'll go," said Maya quickly. "No, I asked Beatrice," responded Miss Carter. But Gwendolen, who wouldn't even go to the bathroom by herself, had slipped out after her sister. May had not sat down again. She stood beside Clovis, as though she could come between him and his misery. In its bowl in the centre of the table, the pink shape, which had looked so good through the window, had sunk into a watery mush. Miss Minton appeared in the doorway. "Good evening, Clovis," she said. Clovis took a step towards her. "Good evening, Miss Minton." She looked just as she had looked on the boat, sharp-faced and strong. He had liked her from the start. She was fierce, but she was straight, and for a moment he was sure she would be able to help him. "Please take the boy out and order Furrer to take him back to Manor House at once," ordered Mrs. Carter. "Oh, not tonight," begged Mayor. "Surely. Tonight. I hope you're satisfied making us use the boat and wasting fuel on a runaway boy." Miss Minton gave Mayor a quelling look. "That will do, Mayor. Come along, Clovis. I'm really ashamed of you putting the Carters to so much trouble." Clovis shook off her arm and gave up hope. "I'll come by myself," he said. If Miss Minton too were his enemy, there was nothing to be done. The two Englishmen had returned from upriver in a very nasty temper. They had spent 2 days on a boat with piglets and chickens and an old woman who was seasick, even though the river hardly moved in the still heat. There were no bunks, only hammocks strung on deck, and Mr. Trapwood fell out of his in the middle of the night onto the Inspector of Schools from Rio, who was not pleased. Even worse had befallen Mr. Lowe, who had decided to have a swim when the boat stopped to find more wood, and came out of the water to find a dozen blood-sucking leeches feasting on his behind. And when they had got to the Umbuda, there was no sign of Bernard Taverner's son. The interpreter, whom Colonel Silver had sent with them, was very helpful. He went ahead to the chief of the Umbuda and greeted him in his own language and said that Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood were very important people who had come from Great Britain to search for a missing boy. But what he also said in a low voice was that these two gentlemen were being a great trouble to the colonel, who begged the chief and his friends to tell them some story about a lost boy, which would keep them quiet and make them go away again. The Umbuda chief and his friends were only too pleased to do this. They did not like Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood, who had not brought any of the presents one usually brings when visiting a tribe, fish hooks and knives and cooking pots, and they loved making up stories. So they told them about an English boy, fair-haired and beautiful as the sun, who had been here, but had wandered away again. "Where to?" asked the crows eagerly. "Where did he go?" "In the direction of the Sacred Mountain," said the chief, pointing to the north. No, in the direction of the Mambutu forest," his second-in-command, pointing to the opposite direction. "Forgive me, father," said the chief's young son, "but the boy went on the river," and he pointed somewhere different again. "Ask them when this was," said Mr. Trapwood excitedly. So the Indians and the interpreter talked among themselves, and then they went to a hut on the edge of the clearing and fetched out an old woman. The old woman wasn't just old, she was ancient, with arms and legs like sticks and not a tooth in her head. When the chief explained what he wanted, she grinned happily and said, yes, she remembered the boy very well. His eyes were as blue as the blossom of the jocanda tree, and his hair glistened like the belly of the golden toad that squats on the lily leaves on the Mamari River, said the old woman, who was having a good time. His skin was as white as the moon in the season of... "Yes, but when? When?" interrupted the crows rudely. "When was he here?" The old woman sat down on a tree stump and began to count. She used her fingers and her toes and then some pebbles on the ground, and the chief and his friends helped her. Then she winked at the interpreter and said it had been 50 years ago. "What?" shouted Mr. Trapwood. 50 years? She nodded and said yes, she was sure, because it was when she was a very small girl and she still had her milk teeth in her head. And the Indians nodded also and said yes. She had often told them of the lost boy who came when she was no higher than the tail of a swamp deer. And they led her back to the hut, patting on her back while she giggled with glee. So the crows had to give up, but they could not leave because the boat to Manaus was not due for another 2 days, and they had a very uncomfortable time staying with the Umbuda, who drummed a lot and seemed to live mostly on nuts. That the tribe were sharing their food and their shelter very generously did not occur to the crows, who had been brought up to think of the Indians as savages. By the time they returned to Manaus, the Englishmen were not in very good shape. "I've had enough of this," said Mr. Trapwood, as they sat in their room at the Pension Maria, overlooking the docks. "So have I," croaked Mr. Lowe. "This business has got to be settled. The bishop goes back in 10 days' time, and the Taverner boy is going to be on it." "If he exists," said Mr. Trapwood gloomily. "Of course he exists," said Mr. Lowe. "You saw the letter." "Well, why doesn't anyone come forward, or anyone else?" said Mr. Trapwood. "Do you think we should put up the reward?" replied Lowe. "The old chap said we were to use our judgment." "I suppose we might as well. After all, it's not us that's paying it. What we need to know now, though, is a thorough house-to-house search of the buildings outside the city. If Taverner was a naturalist, he probably wouldn't live in the middle of town, and they might not have seen the notices out there." "I'm sure that chap at the museum knows something," said Mr. Lowe moodily. "The one who said that Taverner didn't have a son." Then the little Brazilian maid brought in their supper, which was the same as lunch and the same as breakfast. Brown beans stewed with pig's trotters. Mr. Lowe dug about in it gloomily, looking for bits of grizzle, and Mr. Trapwood found a dead ant on his plate. It seemed to be a perfectly clean ant, but he gagged and pushed his plate away. "This place is closer to hell on earth than anywhere I've ever been," he said.